So, bringing back this concept of timing, for instance, at the moment, you'd want to look at what's happening in the world in terms of the economy, what's happening in the West in terms of the economy, what's happening in terms of Russia and the war with Ukraine. All of these things become very, very interesting. But also, for instance, in the art world, there's a big conversation about how art is now becoming a vehicle for money laundering for many of these entities. So, whilst that might not impact your negotiation skills, it's something for you to bear in mind that people might be trading a lot of art, might be buying a lot of things, and there might be this very volatile market, but it might not necessarily mean that it's to your benefit. So you've got to just make sure you kind of consciously aware of these things, right? You might have to play a level of choreography in making sure that when you begin or when you approach a counterpart for negotiation, you're doing it at the timing is also quite apt because it might secure you the best outcome. Changes in the external marketplace, very important. We've just spoken about that. Timing, again, if you think about also the negotiation, quite often it's not just about when you started, it's the duration of the negotiation. Because sometimes the longer the duration of the negotiation, quite often both parties are having time to sit back, digest, exchange information, and might also walk away from this negotiation. So in terms of a creative, quite often you will sit back and you think, well, this process is quite long drawn out. I'm wondering if it's a tactic that the counterpart's using to kind of pressurize me into accepting a lower deal, less a fee, or a compromise. So, you've just got to be conscious of this, that timing and the length and the duration of the negotiations is quite often something you have to be acutely aware of. But on the opposite end of things, sometimes quicker negotiations are also quite good indicators that you are desirable and what you're offering is something that they really want. And, it might work out to your best interest. What's not really good is if you go back then and up your fee or your commission or your deal without them being able to offer or change their terms and conditions, because it just shows that you then kind of taking advantage of a particular situation, which might not come across as a good thing. And I think what you want to do you have to be very, very mindful of that the minute the negotiations are also concluded, is elements of the negotiations or terms of the negotiation are brought to fruition. So you've got to be also very mindful that you just don't get caught up in this whole thing of like, well, I've concluded it, but you're not realizing, well, actually there were a whole lot of terms and conditions to the negotiation. And quite often this is where drama starts happening, and there's litigation, and then there's kind of threats and kind of, allegations that one didn't kind of live up to the deal. So this is something you've got to be very careful about, is that the negotiations have to be distilled into a written kind of agreement, contract, and the terms of these things have to be very, very lucid. They cannot be vague at all. And quite often, creatives get caught up in signing contracts that are quite vague and then would say, but I didn't know, maybe I could have. And that's not a situation you want to get into. So in the negotiations, you've got to understand the terms of delivery. It's super, super, super important. And then the last thing which I want to talk about is really about the process of negotiation. So once you get to a stage, quite often creatives will say, okay, well, come back to me with a proposal. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because the other person is going to think, okay, great, we'll go back to XYZ with a proposal. You might receive the proposal and you might be very offended by that proposal, yet you've asked for it. So don't quite be quick to say, give me a proposal, I'll consider it. It'd be quite good that you know your worth, your value, and you set the tone. And you set the tone, because once they give you back something which you don't like, you're going to be so easily offended by it and think, well, how dare they come back? But actually, I don't think that they quite understand maybe possibly your work or your value, or they would just be being cheeky in business and trying to, hedge their bets with you. So be very, very mindful of this. And I think the other thing is you can have an approach of being exceptionally reactive to this kind of proposal or this counter offer that they bring to you. Or you can say, I'll be reactive in terms of not looking at their response or their proposal, but in reshaping this context of negotiation. So that's like a super crucial thing, I think, for me. The last thing I want to just touch on is that the negotiations bring a huge amount of anxiety and stress and frustration. And this leads to people on both sides of negotiation to perceive things as threats or threatening. So they forget the matter or the issues of hand that need to be discussed, and they become very emotionally charged. And this doesn't lead to any necessary success, because they are looking at it as a battle and they're not being cooperative in their approach. They're putting a kind of competitive posture amongst themselves. They're like, who's going to win this? So even if the other side comes with this competitive posture, you shouldn't come to this party with that competitive posture. You should always maintain your composure, and you should be devoid from any forms of anxiety, because these two things don't make for good negotiation at all. A level of calmness, level-headedness, objectivity, and also being quite amiable is very important. This is not to say that you actually have to compromise to the point that you actually are devoid of any value and any benefit. That's not at all what I'm saying, but it just means that you're not placed in this situation often. It might not be something that you are keen on being part of, and you might want to even outsource this form of negotiation, which is also something that you shouldn't be averse to, because you might just lack the constituency to be dealing with these kind of things, and you might end up taking it too personally. And quite often as creatives, we thinkers, we emotional, we tactile kind of beings, and people on the other side are quite cold, rigid, and very, very inflexible in their approach. So it's quite good that you might have an accountant, you might have a lawyer, you might have another agent representing you that takes on the role of this. But these people will probably try and unlock far more value within the negotiation than you would. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and be part of this process. I always say to any creative that you shouldn't be devoid from being part of this process, because it's a business deal. It's something which impacts and affects you directly, and you've got to be very immersed in this. You have to be involved and included in this process of negotiation. You may not you may sit in as an observer and may not say much, and you might have moments in between where you are speaking to your agent or representative or proxy, but you have to be in a situation of being in control of these negotiations. Otherwise, you may feel quite resentful down the line. But I think overall, negotiations are tactical choices, and these choices that are made that should be made to progress your career, your path, your work, your business, and you shouldn't be afraid to embrace them. Nobody is just born with these skills, but they're not skills that are unattainable. They're just skills that or they're things that you need to be very, very, very aware of. Because the more you are in control over processes that affect you and affect the destiny or your path, then the more you are able to kind of be a very kind of fulfilled and purposeful creator.